bit of map making. So here's a couple of the maps that I've made. How I made these maps is with elevation data that our satellites have made, and they're publicly available. I take the elevation data and I put them in a few different programs. If you've ever heard of ArcGIS, another one called Blender, and then of course Photoshop. So most of the maps that I make, they're not really like practical to be used. They're really for decorative purposes. So I make maps of places that people want to put on their wall because they've been there, or places that they're passionate about. But what I'm here to talk to you about today is historical maps, and specifically maps that shape U.S. history. So when I was trying to put together this presentation, it was kind of difficult to decide what maps I wanted to include. There's a lot of maps that have influenced U.S. history, such as bad surveys that have been done at the Texas-Mexico border that eventually resulted in the Gadsden Purchase, or some old maps of the Pacific Northwest that caused a border dispute or a territory dispute between the British and the United States that eventually culminated in what's called the Pig War, if you know anything about that. So I tried to narrow this down to a handful of maps that I thought influenced U.S. history, but also had some good stories behind it. And when I try to start my classes for my 8th grade geography students, I always try to start with something that I think is that they have a little bit of background knowledge on, something they can connect to before zooming out. So I thought no better way than to start with the historical geography of Henry County. So my first map here is a 1728 Virginia, North Carolina border map by William Mayo. So you might already recognize that last name there. So a little bit of backstory on this. In the early 18th century, the North Carolina-Virginia border, it really hadn't been defined yet. And this was causing a lot of issues. There were people that lived on the border that were saying they were paying taxes in one colony, telling the other colony they were paying the other colony, so they just ended up not paying any taxes. And it was also causing a problem with law enforcement. No one really knew whose jurisdiction was whose. So finally, the governors of both colonies decided that this needed to be fixed, and so they came together. They finally picked a starting point. They put together a team of surveyors, and one of them was William Mayo, and he created this map. And another man that was in this group was a man named William Byrd. And so I'm going to read some of the things that William Byrd wrote in his journal as he entered Henry County. So this is a little section of Henry County, what is today Henry County, from this map right here. So he says, "We came upon a large branch of the river, which we called the Irvine, in honor of our learned professor." So he was referring to Alexander Irvine, who was a professor at William Mary, and he was a Virginia surveyor. So here's the Irvine River. And Byrd and Mayo both spelt it differently. Byrd spells it without the E. Mayo spells it with the E right here. So there's a few different variations of it. I've even seen one that said Irwin. I think that was probably just copied wrong. So then he says, "We encamped on a pleasant hill overlooking the river, which seemed to be deep everywhere except just where we forded. The rocks were so slippery, the horses could hardly keep their feet." And Mayo apparently wanted to go down to where the Irvine and Dan River met. But Byrd said it wasn't a good idea. He said, "I would not consent to it for fear that thou shalt fall into some disaster, we being now near the path where the northern Indians take when they march against those of the south." So they didn't go down to where it meets. And then he says about 4 miles beyond the River Irwin. So this is his words, not my words, because it's somewhat offensive. He says, "We forded Matrimony Creek, called so by an unfortunate married man because it was exceedingly noisy and impetuous. However, though the stream was clamorous, yet like those women who make themselves plains heard, it is likewise perfectly clear and unsullied." So Matrimony Creek is still Matrimony Creek. And then a half mile further, we see a mountain, or they saw a mountain. It was 5 miles to the northwest. And this is not on the map, He said we called it the wart because it appeared no bigger than a wart in comparison of the great mountains which hid their haughty heads in the clouds. So he was likely referring to Chestnut Knot, or what is right at the end of the ridge there. Then he talks a lot about the animals. He talks about how many bears they killed, the turkeys, and then he has an interesting quote about pigeons. He says, "The flocks of these birds of passage are so amazingly great, sometimes they darken the sky." So he was probably referring to the extinct passenger pigeons. And then he goes on and he talks about really the human geography of the area, which was mostly natives. And he says, "The atmosphere was so smoky all around us that the mountains were again grown invisible. This happened not from the haziness of the sky, but from the firing of the woods by the Indians. For we were now near the route the northern savages take when they go out to war against the Catawbas and other southern nations. On their way, the fires they make in their camps are left burning, which, catching the dry leaves they lie near, soon put the adjacent woods into a flame. Some of our men, in search of their homes, discovered one of these Indian camps, where not long before they had been furring and dressing their skins." And so then he says about 230 poles. So a pole is 16.5 feet. It's a British unit of measurement. He says about 230 poles beyond that, the line intersected another river that seemed to be a branch of the Irvine, to which we gave the name Mayo, in complement to our other surveyors. It was about 50 yards wide, and we forded it, being just below a ledge of rocks, which reach across the river and made a natural cascade. So if you zoom in on Google Earth, you can see what appears to be the cascade that he was referring to when they crossed the river. And so then they go a little bit further, and he says, "We gave it the name Crooked Creek because of its frequent meanders." So this is where they stop. So this is about midway through Patrick County, or modern day Patrick County. So this is where they stop their survey. And so there is some names have been changed since. Irvine River is, of course, the Smith River. What they call the Mayo River, now we know it's the North and the South Branch. And they didn't realize the Dan River actually kept going. So it goes a little bit farther west. And so the Mayo and the Dan River actually meet just outside Madison, North Carolina. So Bird must have liked the area, because he bought 20,000 acres just across the border in North Carolina, and he named it Eden. So William Byrd is the founder of Eden. And then Mayo, he went on to make the original grid for Richmond. And this bridge on the left is named Mayo Bridge. His grandson made a floating bridge. It got destroyed like 7 or 8 times, and eventually this bridge was built. And on the right is a map that Mayo actually made before the survey. He mapped all of Barbados, and this map is made off of his surveying work. So that leads us to the next map here. Is about 20 years after Mayo and Byrd, they drew their line. People started moving farther west into Patrick County and beyond, and the line needed to be drawn further. And so Peter Jefferson, who is the father of Thomas Jefferson, and a man named Joshua Fry, they were tasked with extending that border. And we actually have a French copy of this downstairs of this particular map. So they extend the line, and who was the second Earl of Halifax, he was the president of the Board of Trade for the colonies. He said that he needed accurate maps of the colonies, so they use the survey from the line. They have some other surveys. They take some information from other surveyors, and they form this map. So if we zoom in to where Henry County is, we can see what appears to be Leatherwood Creek. They have it as Leatherhead Creek. Reed Creek is spelled as Reedy Creek. We've got Ward Mountain on the map here. You can see the Great Road going straight through Henry County there. The Irvine Rivers, the Smith River. You can see on this map they've changed the north and the south branch of the Mayo, and you can see that correction on the Dan River has been made. And what's kind of interesting about this map is this is the only map that I've seen that if you look where that junction is for the north and the south branch of the Mayo River. It's the only map I've seen where it's actually over in Virginia. Even the original Mayo map had it below, and then in all future maps I've seen, it's been corrected. So I'm not quite sure why on this map it's not. It's the only one I've seen. So that leads us to this next map. And this is a 1755 map by John Mitchell titled A Map of the British and French Dominions in North America. And this map used the map I just showed you by Jefferson and Fry. That was used to help make this map. And this map is arguably the most important map in U.S. history, which I'll get to that reason here in a second. So a little bit of background on John Mitchell is John Mitchell, he was born in Lancaster County, Virginia, and he went to Scotland to study medicine. He came back home to open up his own practice in Urbana, Virginia. And him and his wife started having a lot of health problems, and he thought that if they moved to England, where the climate was cooler, that they would be able to recuperate. So he moves to England, and while he's over there, he makes friends with a lot of, important people. And one of those was the same guy who asked for the map, the Jefferson Fry map, and the guy, the second Earl of Halifax. So he asked him to make him a map. So he makes him a map, and he likes it, but he thinks it can be improved. And so he asked for all these maps to be sent over, including the Jefferson Fry map. He gives him access to information and documents that he didn't have before. That way he's not just relying on what's publicly available. And so he makes this map, which is often referred to as the Mitchell map. So one of the reasons that he asked him to make this map is because he's trying to push his political agenda, and that is French aggression in North America. And so if you look at the map down at the bottom, you can see Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia. Their borders are going all the way to the Pacific Ocean, wherever the Pacific Ocean may be. And so this was also claimed by the French. And so you see French forts are scattered all across what they would consider their territory. Well, this kind of implies that this is an illegal act by the French. They're encroaching on British territory. So this guy's going around and showing all of his political friends, and then it's published, the public sees it. So this map, it influences people in England to stand up to the French, that they're encroaching on our territory. So this is something that contributed to the start of the French and Indian War. And so down here in the bottom right, you've got the border of Florida, which is pushed significantly farther south than what the Spanish would claim is there. So if there's any type of dispute between the British or another empire, then it's going to go to the British on this map, because it was made by the British. And so fast forward to the Revolutionary War. The war ends, and our French allies, they gave an offer to the United States of where they thought the borders should be drawn. And the deal wasn't really a good deal. Basically, the United States would have been stuck just east of the Appalachian Mountains. They wouldn't have been able to go beyond. In the middle between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi River, the French proposed that it be basically a buffer state of Native Americans, and then the Spanish would be over it, and then the French would get everything west of the Mississippi River. So the Founding Fathers really didn't think that was a really good deal, and figured they could probably get a better deal if they just dealt with England directly. And so they were actually right. The Prime Minister of Britain said he thought this was an opportunity to break the United States away from their French allies, and also saw this as an opportunity to make a really strong trading partner. And so they give them a better deal. And the John Mitchell map was used by both parties at the Treaty of Paris in 1783. So this is Richard Oswald's copy that he used at the negotiations. And you've got a bunch of different red lines marked up here. You can barely see it. You might can see my mouse, but this was the border that was ultimately agreed upon. You can't, now the United States never actually saw this copy of the map. And some speculate, there's a lot of other red lines drawn here. These are like past treaties that Britain had signed, but some speculate that this red line up top, that it implied that secretly they were willing to give up more land to the United States than what was agreed upon. I don't necessarily think that's true, because you can look at this next map, and this is John Jay's map. He had a map too, and he also drew a line that was a little bit farther. You can barely see it here. A little bit farther than what was actually agreed upon. And this particular copy, the New York Historical Society has this particular copy. And Benjamin Franklin actually makes it clear that it was used. He writes a letter to Thomas Jefferson, and he says, "I can now assure you that I am perfectly clear in the remembrance that the map we used in tracing the boundary was brought to the treaty by the Commissioner of England, that it was the same that was published by Mitchell about 20 years before." So, ironically, the map that was originally titled British Dominions ends up being the map that chops up the British Dominion. So, a few other interesting features about the map. It's got Michigan, or Lake Michigan, a little bit farther north than where it actually is in real life. This would actually end up leading to the Toledo War, which was a border dispute between Michigan and Ohio. And then if we kind of zoom in here, Henry County is right there in the middle. It's got the junction of the Mayo a little bit farther south, and then still has the Irvine River there. So if you want to see a copy of the map in person, Urbana, Virginia, where John Mitchell started his practice, they have a copy. Back in like 1980, they spent about $7,000 or $8,000 and purchased one, had it it's refurbished, and now it's worth over $500,000. So if you want to see a map, they have one in their visitor center. So this next map, you might have seen before, one of the most famous maps in U.S. history. So this is the map that was made after the Lewis and Clark expedition. And this was 1814 map by Samuel Lewis. It was copied from the manuscript by William Clark. So this map is so important because it really sparks the beginning of Western expansion by mapping a lot of unknown territory, making a lot of corrections, identifying tribes. And what it also does is it really solidifies the U.S. position that the Pacific Northwest belongs to us. So in a lot of ways, as you just saw from the map before, maps can be political propaganda. And by actually mapping areas, it's a lot easier to have a legitimate claim and say, this is our territory. So what you see in a lot of historical maps too is they kind of build off of each other. So they're usually a combination of different surveying work. Sometimes no original survey work is done. Very rarely is, as time goes, is there original survey work. And so all the maps that we've seen built off of each other, including this one. Thomas Jefferson, he wrote a letter to this guy, Nicholas King, and said, hey, you should use the John Mitchell map to try to map some of that Western territory. Now, I don't actually see any indicators that it was used, but Thomas Jefferson did write to him and recommend that he use the Mitchell map to help make this map. And this map was a map that Lewis and Clark took with them. So it's kind of a myth that Lewis and Clark went into completely unmapped territory. There was definitely a lot of surveys that had been done. A lot of it hadn't been compiled together. And one of those, and they actually took a bunch of maps with them. So this one is an 1803 map by Nicholas King. And if you look closely, you can see the Missouri River. So if you can see my mouse there, right through there, on this map, it's just a dotted line. Kind of indicating we know where it kind of is, but it's really not super detailed. But what he does have is up here, that's what's called the Great Bend, and this is the Mandan villages. And this particular area was mapped by a man named David Thompson. So David Thompson, he's probably mapped more of North America, probably more than anyone ever. He used to work for the Hudson Bay Company, and I guess he had a mapping problem, or mapping addiction, and he wanted to map a bunch of areas that Hudson Bay had no interest in him mapping. And so he leaves, he goes and works for the Northwest Company. But he mapped the Great Bend here. It's included in Nicholas King's map that Lewis and Clark took with them on their expedition. What's also on the Nicholas King map is this map, and this is actually a map that was drawn by a guy that was in the Hudson's Bay Company, but he got this information from a native named Akamaki. So what he did was he had him draw this information in the sand, and then he copied it onto paper. So what you're looking at here is this horizontal line here. That is the Rocky Mountains, and you've got a lot of tributaries that are going into the Missouri River. So a lot of the area actually had kind of been mapped. And later on, Lewis and Clark also took this map with them. And so this is that section that first section, that dotted line on Nicholas King. He didn't have this information yet. And so this is by a couple guys, James McKay and John Evans. They also used to work for the Hudson's Bay Company, but they left and they ended up working for the Spanish, and they surveyed all this. You can actually see Clark's handwriting up in the top left there. So they had several of McKay and Evans' maps. What they also had was they had one of McKay's journals that he had given them. And in the journal, he talked about some volcano in like western Nebraska. Well, there was no volcano, so Lewis kind of notes in his journal about how he can't find the volcano that McKay had mentioned. And then there was actually some maps, one map that was published before on Louisiana Territory by Samuel Lewis, the same man who ends up engraving the Lewis and Clark map that we know today. And it's not very detailed. It has the Missouri River in there. And then later on, Patrick Gass, he was a member of the expedition. He is the first one to publish his journal. Meriwether Lewis isn't very happy about it. He writes this article basically telling people don't take it seriously. He doesn't have the geographic or scientific knowledge to make this, so just kind of ignore it and wait for ours to come out. And well, he does it anyway, and you can see it's pretty much a direct copy. I guess he was kind of right. He didn't really have any new information. But Patrick Gass, interesting guy, he ends up serving, he stays in the Army, ends up serving in the War of 1812. He loses an eye, and then at the age of 91, he tries to fight in the Civil War. He shows up at a recruiting office, and he has to be physically removed because he said he was there to fight the rebels. And so this is the manuscript that map is based off of. This is an 1810 manuscript map by William Clark. So he made a few different manuscript maps at different ports along the way, but this is the one that this map is based off of. So Samuel King copies this directly. So some interesting features on this map is at the top you have longitude west from Washington. At the bottom you have longitude west from London. So this is kind of interesting because at the time we think about Greenwich as being the prime meridian. There was no agreed upon prime meridian at this time. And so at the top it comes from Washington. It was kind of a national pride thing, like we're going to start our prime meridian in the United States. And Thomas Jefferson, when he was Secretary of State, he's actually the one that made this prime meridian. And it starts at the White House. And then at the bottom we have London. And this was probably because this ends up being published in London as well, so you want them to be able to read the coordinates without having to do math on it. So at the bottom you have Sergeant Floyd's grave and Sergeant Floyd's river. So he was the only person that died on the expedition, which is pretty much a miracle between all the different hazards that they faced on the expedition. Being chased by bears, Meriwether Lewis gets shot. The Spanish go after him. Luckily, they never found him. They have a run-in with the Teton Sioux. So Floyd ends up being the only one that died, luckily, and likely from a ruptured appendix. So over here on the right, this is actually not from the Lewis and Clark's expedition. On the right, this is the path of John Coulter. So he was a member of the expedition. On the way back, this is the original mountain map. So on the way back, they encounter some traders coming back upriver, and Coulter asks if he can leave the army and go join these guys, and so they let him out. So he heads back out west, And he ends up being the first guy who was ever, or the first person of European descent to ever see Yellowstone and the Grand Tetons. And so he collects this information. When he heads back to St. Louis, he debriefs Clark, and then William Clark includes all of it on his manuscript map. And so he also tells people about this geothermal activity and stuff that he saw out west, and people start mocking him, and they call it Coulter's Hell. And so one of the reasons, or the main reason for the expedition, was for economic reasons. Now, Jefferson, he was kind of more into the discovery. He wanted to know about the geography. He wanted to know about the animals, the new plants, the Indians. He was just really curious in what was out there. But that's not how you get funding from Congress. Congress does not care about those things. And so how he pitched it to Congress and to justify the expedition was, we're going to find the Northwest Passage. You know, of course that didn't exist. Every expedition at the time was to find this Northwest Passage. But the river didn't connect. But what they did find was a lot of natives that could be traded with. And so they label, up in the top left here, how many people lived in each one of these in the area. They label a bunch of tribes where they live. And down the bottom right, it says, between these rivers, the different bonds of Sioux meet every spring to trade with each other and the white traders who visit them. And so in the bottom left, you have these straight mountains. And you see a lot of mountains like this on maps in this time period. And the theory that I've heard on this is that all mountains in North America were kind of compared to the Appalachian Mountains. Because a lot of the Appalachian Mountains, especially like around the Blue Ridge Mountains, they're kind of in these straight lines. You go up the mountains, you come down to a valley, and go back up again. And so all mountains were in some ways kind of assumed that's just how they were in North America. Up in the top right, they named a river after Sacagawea. So it's kind of a myth that she was a guide. She didn't really guide the expedition, but she did make a lot of very significant contributions. And one of those was one of the boats overturned, and documents and books and equipment and everything went all over the river. And so Sacagawea saved a bunch of these items. And without her, I mean, the expedition would have essentially been pointless because they'd have lost all the documents. There wouldn't be this map. And so they named this river after her because of what she did. So that leads us to this next map. We're going to go back in time a little bit and talk about this 1612 map by John Smith. So John Smith, he makes this map collects the information for this map by going on two small expeditions, starting from Jamestown. They take about a month or so each. And he has the natives kind of guide around the area. He could speak the local language, and so he gathers all this information, and he turns it into this map. And it's extremely detailed. You can actually make out where a lot of modern cities are. If you look where Richmond's at, Richmond's sitting right on those waterfalls. And so he includes waterfalls on this map because if you're wanting to trade, I mean, of course, at the time, rivers, I mean, that's basically your highway. There's no roads. And so you need to know where the waterfalls are at to know what your limits are of how far you can travel. So another thing he does is when he goes and collects this information, he labels on the map with crosses, and I've labeled them here with these red dots, of how far he went himself. So any information after this, he has collected from the natives. The natives have told him what's out there. So to me, it seems like he has a good amount of confidence in what the natives are telling him is true, but he just wants to know whoever's looking at the map, that they should just look at it with a grain of salt, that he personally did not see it and map it himself. So something else he does is he labels all of the different tribes that he encounters, all the different villages that he encounters. And so for a tribe that has what's called a werelance, which is the ability to assemble warriors, he puts with a longhouse. And if they don't have one, then he puts a smaller, just a dot there. But he calls them kings, and this is because he wants to put it in English terms so they understand it. And let me mention too, I forgot to mention, if you look at this is a map of Virginia, but it's turned on its side. I should probably mention that. This is the Chesapeake area right here. So they didn't how do I put this? So north is going this way. It wasn't common yet to have north at the top of the map. So it's like if you're in England and then you're sailing to Virginia, and so it's like you're facing Virginia from the sea. So it's turned on its side, if that makes sense. And even though it's labeled Virginia, of course it doesn't cover all of Virginia. Virginia's claims are much larger than this. What we're really looking at here is Powhatan territory. And he also labels the different names of the tribes. We've got the Chesapeake right here, where the Chesapeake Bay gets its name. It's sitting right over here. So some other features of the map, he has a longhouse in the top left. All right, so this longhouse is what he saw when he was captured in 1607. So this is Chief Powhatan right there in the middle. And then on the right, he has a drawing of a Susquehannock Indian who he said was a giant like people. Now, copyright laws didn't really exist at the time. They basically stole this from John White, who had made maps of Virginia, basically most of modern-day North Carolina, before this, when the Roanoke colony was going on. And there's some theories on why he thought they were so giant. Archaeological evidence doesn't suggest that they were really giant. Some think that maybe the Susquehannocks actually sent just their most intimidating warriors to greet John Smith. And so some other interesting features about the map here is in the top left, you've got John Smith's coat of arms, and you've got 3 heads there. And that is because supposedly, though John Smith has a lot of crazy stories that I kind of wonder if are true, but supposedly he killed 3 Ottomans in hand-to-hand combat, and so his coat of arms has their 3 heads. And then at the bottom, it has some words in Latin, and it translates, to conquer is to live. And then, of course, I talked about the compass, the orientation. At the top, we're heading west, versus north is going over to the right. And then we've got the royal coat of arms. And then if you look at the bottom, it says discovered and described by Captain John Smith, engraved by William Hull, and it says 1606, which is kind of interesting because they didn't arrive in Jamestown until 1607. So not quite sure why they decided to go with that year. So Captain John Smith probably didn't actually draw this map, but generally, especially then, you're generally given credit. He's the one that conducted the survey. William Hull probably did a lot of the drawings based off of his manuscript. And so what makes this map so important to the history of the United States, other than just being an artifact, is that part of his purpose in making this map was to promote the colonies. And he does this very realistically. He doesn't show on the map that there's all this gold, all this silver, but what he shows is that the land is very fertile. There's navigable rivers. He shows a population that is being sustained through hunting. He also shows there's different species of plants. There's trees that can be used maybe for a shipbuilding industry, for homes, for burning. And so he shows that this is an area that can potentially sustain a permanent colony with families and not just men and a military fort. And he kind of makes a similar map for New England as well. So John Smith was a huge advocate for colonization, and he successfully did that through a lot of his writings and the 2 maps that he made. And so a lot of other countries, they started making copies of this map, especially the Dutch and the Flemish, because this was during the Dutch Golden Age. And so they made quite a few different copies. This particular map is a 1630 map by Henricus Hondius. His brother, Jodicus Hondius, had made one years prior. And he died, and then his wife sold his copper plates for the map to him and his brother's rival named Willem Blau. And so Henricus Hondius was pretty upset about that. And then, so he has to go and get his own copper plates made, and he makes this map. So what's kind of interesting about this map is that there's mountains everywhere. There are no mountains here. So he adds mountains to it. And this is also the only derivative where the native is looking towards the Chesapeake Bay instead of away from it. And I actually brought one of those it was made sometime between 1630 and 1640. I brought a copy of that with me today if you would like to take a look after the presentation. So one of my favorite maps that uses the information from John Smith's map is this map. It's based off a manuscript by John Ferret, and it was published in 1667 by John Overton. So what's really interesting about this map is it has the Pacific Ocean. In the text, it says a 10 days march. So you can get to the Pacific Ocean from one coast to the other, a 10 days march. Wow, that would be really short. But what I think this also kind of highlights is how much easier it was to find latitude than it was to find longitude. Because it actually says, so Sir Francis Drake had actually been to modern-day California, was basically San Francisco, decades prior to Jamestown. And so he didn't set up a colony, he wasn't equipped to set up a colony, nor would they have been able to supply a colony all the way in California. But he calls it New Albion, he moves on, and what's interesting is he actually supposedly left a man, and this man, he left him because the guy was going to die, and he thought that this was the only way he's going to survive, is if we leave him here, he recuperates. And so the man supposedly does recuperate, so he walks for 4 years all the way to Mexico before finding the Spanish. So I kind of find it interesting this information, if it's true, didn't make it back, because even though Mexico to the south, his route would have still been significantly further west, and we would have known it could not have been a 10 days march. And so John Smith's map continued to be used for over 50 years. So it wasn't until this man named Augustine Herman finally conducted a fresh survey of the area, and he does it because he basically does it to trade for a plot of land in Maryland. So this is an 1889 map by a man named William T. Hornaday. And the reason I show this map is now we're kind of getting to the modern era. And I kind of just wanted to show that today the maps still have the power to influence and shape people's opinion, that it doesn't necessarily have to be just because of different survey work. So this is what you call a thematic map, because it's displaying information. And so what this map is showing is it's showing the former range of the American bison. And so the backstory here is in 1886, William T. Hornaday, he's the head taxidermist of the Smithsonian, and it's just accepted that the bison, they're gone, they're going to be extinct. And so there's not very many of them left, and so he figures, well, we might as well go get some and kill them and bring them back to the museum so future generations can see them, because if somebody else does it, well, then no one's going to see them. And so they do that. He goes out west, kills between 20 and 30 of them, brings them back, but he ends up kind of having a change of heart and realizes, maybe we can actually save them. And so he writes a book called The Extermination of the American Bison, and it has this map in it. And without even reading the book, you can look at the map and kind of tell something's gone wrong. We've done something wrong here. If you look, Bison were as far as Henry County. And there's a perfect correlation between settlement of European settlers and Bison no longer being there. So you don't even have to read the book to recognize we've done something wrong. And so he takes this book and he ends up publishing several other books, and he gives a copy to each congressman. And I brought with me, if you want to see it after the presentation, one of those copies that he gave to a congressman named Martin A. Foran, and it comes with the map. And so the last map here really isn't a map, but more of a projection. So a projection, if you don't know, the world, believe it or not, is actually round. And so you can't take a round object and you can't put it on a 2D surface. So you have what's called a projection. And so this guy named Gerardus Mercator, he invented a new projection to make it easier to navigate. So basically you can draw a straight line on the map anywhere. You don't have to keep self-correcting while you're in the middle of the ocean. You just keep shooting that azimuth, and you'll go to where you need to go. And this made navigation much easier, of course, colonization much easier. People were getting places not always faster because we're not always taking the shortest route, but it made navigation so much easier. And you've probably seen this projection thousands of times in your life without realizing it. This is the same projection that's used in classrooms. This is why my 8th graders come to me and think that Antarctica is like half of the Earth, because it's the continents are stretched, or the land is stretched the farther you get away from the equator. And this is the same projection that you see on Google Maps. So this guy invented this in the 1600s, but we still see this projection, some of us almost every single day. And that is actually my last map. Does anybody have any questions or anything? Yes.
I'm curious what got you interested in maps initially, and then also what further got you interested to actually create your own map making business.
So that I kind of ask myself that a lot. I think part of it might be. I think there might be a little bit of a correlation between traveling and maps too. I know when I was a kid, I went to Florida and Boston, and I think like once you like leave an area, you start to identify that like this is a place, and there's other places out there, and I think that probably had a little bit of an impact on it. I don't know. I've always kind of preferred even map video games. I used to play like Rome Total War or Sim City and stuff like that. And then you asked, how did I get into making the maps? So originally, I was actually going to college for health and PE, and nothing wrong with that. But I got a little bit bored with it. And I remember we didn't have a geography class when I was in school. We had history classes, but I took a geography class when I was going to Radford, and I just like knew so much of it. And the professor said, "Oh, why aren't you majoring in this?" And I was like, "That's a really good question." And I remember he had a class called geospatial engineering, and I signed up for it, but it wasn't part of my major. And so my health and PE professor said, no, that's not part of your degree plan. You can't take that. And so I was a little bit frustrated. So I said, well, I'll just learn it myself then. And I did actually end up changing my major later on. But basically, at that point, I was just kind of interested in it. Now that I saw it was even a thing, because I didn't even know it was a thing before. So I watched a bunch of YouTube videos and stuff like that, and downloaded ArcGIS and just started clicking around, playing on it, watching tutorials, trying new things. So, anybody else got any questions? Well, if there's no questions, if you want to come take a look at this map right here, this is that Henricus Hondius map. It's a copy from the John Smith map. And then also have a couple maps back here. I've got the Bison map. And then I also brought a map by Gerardus Mercator. It's not a world map, It's actually a map of southern Netherlands and a part of Belgium, but it is a 1619 map by Gerardus Mercator. Oh yeah, there is I think it's was it a 1925? Sorry, what was that? 1924 map of the highways in Virginia.
That one we found just a few days ago, and it's really interesting to see the primitive roads in Martinsville and Henry County Valley in 1924. And you wonder how they think of Bob Childers to that mountain of Mountain 4, they have over 40,000 miles a year in those dirt roads as the man who moved them out. But it's unbelievable how much the roads have changed since 1924. It's just unbelievable what they were then. You ought to look at that. That's unbelievable.
All right, well, thank you all for coming.